Sorry for that interruption. Okay, so continuing with section 6.2 and 6.3, example 1, part D. We've identified our A, B, and C, and we are moving on to finding our factors of 36. So our factors of 36, again, we're going to put it in order, 1 and 36. We can divide it by 2, so 2 and 18. We can divide it by 3. 3 and 12. Now, if you're unsure, just take your calculator, a little basic calculator. Let's see if you can see my screen here. There we go. And all I'm doing is typing in, well, okay, let's see, what are we doing? 36. So 36 divided by 3 equals, oh look, 12. So 3 and 12. 36. Can we divide it by 4? Yes, we can. So then we put 4 and 9. And then we just keep doing that as long as we get whole numbers, right? If we try to divide 36 by 5, we're going to end up getting a decimal, which is not what we want to work with. So the last one that we have here is 6 and 6. We want to take a look at our signs. So here we have a negative C value. And what that negative C value determines is if the signs are going to be the same or different. Because it's negative, the signs are going to be different. And the larger number will match the sign of B. So here the larger number is negative because the B sign is negative. Now, this is where my OCD kind of helps us. If you notice, in every single one of my problems, I typically have a column with smaller numbers and I have a column with all the larger numbers, and that's why this helps me, because now when I'm trying to make all of my larger numbers negative, I can just go right down the column. Say, okay, all those are negative. Let me see if I can fix the lighting here. That's better. All right, so now we ask ourselves which one of these pairs will add up to give us -5. That would be 4 and -9. And we want to work with this. So we're going to rewrite our expression and we're going to expand our middle term, again using the 4 and -9. So we're going to have 12y squared. Now in all of our problems we've been putting this number first and then this number second, and that's not necessarily needed, right? We learned that we could go back and forth between which one goes in whatever spot. And so just to show you that, I'm going to put the -9y first and the 4y as well. And now this actually serves a dual purpose, because now since we have 4 terms and we factor by grouping, now we have a plus in the center. If we had kept it as plus 4y minus 9y, we would have had a minus in the center and had to deal with the minus. We don't have to really do much with it, but it's kind of nice to be able to not have to worry about that if possible. So we look for our GCF of each of our groups. Our GCF of our first group is going to be 3y. We're left with 4y minus 3. The GCF of our second group, there's nothing that we can factor out here, but we do want a placeholder, so I'm going to put a 1 there because we can divide both of these terms by 1 and it won't change anything. And then we're left with 4y minus 3. So within these two terms, what do they have in common? They have a 4y minus 3, and what's left over? 3y plus 1. That would be our final factored form. So moving on to example 2, we are really just practicing this same concept over and over and over and over and over and over again, just with different situations and different scenarios. So again, here we're factoring the trinomial. We have x squared minus 6x minus 16. And again, our very first question that we ask ourselves is, do we have a greatest common factor? No, we don't. So because we don't have a greatest common factor, we're then going to go straight to identifying our A, B, and C values. A is 1, B is -6, C is -16. We take A times C, which is -16, and B, which is -6, and we want to find all of our factors of -16, or just not of negative 16, of 16 itself. So that's 1 and 16, 2 and 8, 4 and 4. Again, we want to look at our signs. So here, because this is negative, we know that our signs are going to be different. And the larger number is going to match the sign of B, so the larger number is going to be negative. So I'm just going to drop a negative down that whole column. And which one of those pairs will add up to give us negative 6? 2 plus negative 8. So to work with this, we will use the 2 and negative 8 to expand that negative 6. So we can write it as x squared plus 2x minus 8x minus 16. And remember, we don't have to put the plus 2x and then the minus 8x. We could put minus 8x and then plus 2x to help us out like we did in the last problem. But I just want to, remind you of how to do it when you have, oh no, a negative in the middle. When we have that, remember, we push the negative towards the 8 and we make the middle into a plus, which is what we want to have there. We find our GCF of each group. So that's x times x plus 2. Remember, because this is a negative in the front, we're going to bring the negative out front, and the GCF between 8 and 16 is 8. So that leaves us with, that leaves us with x minus 2. When we look at both of these terms, right, this term and this term, what do they have in common? You know what? Look at that. They don't have anything in common. But why don't they have anything in common? Because I did something wrong. I didn't divide correctly. Negative 8 divided by negative 8 gives us positive 1, right, which we have invisible in front of here. And we drop down our x. Negative 16 times negative 8 actually is supposed to give us positive 2. There we go. And that's exactly why we factor out the negative, so that we get the correct terms here, and they're the same. So our GCF is x plus 2, and we're left with x minus 8. In part B, we have negative 3x squared minus 21x plus 24. And again, the very first question that we ask ourselves is, do we have a GCF? Is there a GCF? And the answer is yes. In this case, we do. Now, if we look at all of our numbers, 3, 21, and 24, we can divide all of them by 3, so we know that's going to be part of our GCF. And then also, because that leading term is negative, we're going to bring the negative out with our GCF. And this is where our answer line comes into play. Where's our answer line? Can you see it down there? There it is. So we're going to bring that GCF down to the bottom so we don't have to carry it down with us in every single step. So now what's left over once we factor out our GCF of negative 3? Well, negative 3 divided by negative 3 is 1. So that's just going to be x squared. Then we have negative 21x divided by negative 3 is going to be a positive 7x. And then 24 divided by negative 3 is going to give us a negative 8. And just like before, we now identify our A, B, and C as 1, 7, and negative 8. Right? We multiply A times C as negative 8, B is 7. We find our factors of 8, which are 1 and 8, and 2 and 4. We want to find our signs. Remember, when we're looking at our signs, we don't go back to the original. We go right back to the one that we found the A, B, and C for. So here, this tells us that our signs are going to be different because this is a negative. And in this case, the larger number is going to be positive because the B value is positive. So the larger number is positive. That means that the smaller number is negative. And which pair adds up to give us 7? That would be negative 1 and 8. We just keep on going. So we expand our middle term, x squared minus 1x plus 8x minus 8. Since we have 4 terms, we factor by grouping our first 2 terms together and our last 2 terms together. We find our GCF of our first group and our GCF of our last group or second group. Between these two terms, here and here, what do they have in common? The x minus 1. And what's left over? X plus 8. Remember, that's not it. We still have this answer line down here because we had a GCF, so we have to bring that down. X minus 1 times x plus 8. And remember, you could also write it as -3 or -3 times x plus 8 times x minus 1. That would be fine as well. As long as that GCF stays up front, you can switch the place of the two binomials however you like. Part C, we have 7x plus 6x squared minus 3. Now, the thing here is that it's not in the correct order. The order that it should be in is ax squared plus bx plus c, but it's not in that order. The x squared term is in the middle, so the first thing we need to do here is we need to rewrite this to be in the correct form. Bringing the 6x squared up front, and then dropping the 7x behind it, and then finally ending with -3. And once we do that, our steps are the same as the previous, 6 examples. What is our GCF? Nothing. We don't have a GCF, so then we move on to identifying our A, B, and C values. A is 6, B is 7, C is -3. We again do A times C, which is -18. We identify B, which is 7. Our factors of 18 are 1 and 18, 2 and 9, 3 and 6. Our signs are going to be different, and our larger number is positive. The larger number is positive, which means the smaller number is negative. And which one adds up to become 7? That would be -2 and +9. So now we use the -2 and +9 to expand our 7x. So that's 6x squared minus 2x plus 9x minus 3. Again, because we have 4 terms, we factor by grouping, and we have that plus in the center, which is what we're supposed to have. So we factor out our GCF of our first group and our last group. That would be 2x here. And we have left over 3x minus 1. Here we can factor out 3. And we're left with 3x minus 1. The GCF of both of these terms is 3x minus 1. And we are left with 2x plus 3. And that would be our final answer, or our final factored form. Part D, again, we're asking ourselves, do we have a GCF? Aren't you sick of asking yourself that question? That's good, right? My point in this first class is to make you wake up in the middle of the night freaking out and saying, oh my gosh, I have to factor. That's the point. I know, you're going to be sick of it by the end of this. So, again, do we have a GCF? And here we do have a GCF. Now, there's no coefficients that are going to be the GCF, but we do have a variable that's going to be the GCF. We can factor out a y from each one of these. And then, because, again, the leading term is negative, that's a negative y cubed. Because the leading term is negative, we need to bring a negative out with the GCF. And so, just like we did several times before, we're going to have a factor line down here. You see it? You can barely see it. We're going to put the negative y there, and we'll figure out what we have left over. So negative y cubed divided by negative y gives us y squared. Positive 9y squared divided by negative y gives us negative 9y. And negative 14y divided by negative y gives us positive 14. And now we identify our A, B, and C values. 1, -9, and 14. We have A times C, which is 14, B, which is -9. Our factors of 14 are 1 and 14, 2 and 7. Our signs are going to be the same, and both of them are going to be negative. And which one adds up to give us -9? That would be -2 and -7. So we use those numbers to expand our expression. Y squared minus 2y minus 7y plus 14. Since we have 4 terms, we factor by grouping. And when we factor by grouping, we have this minus in the center, so we need to change that to a plus and push the negative towards the y, the 7y. The GCF of our first group is y. We're left with y minus 2. The GCF of our second group is -7. And again, we're left with y minus 2. The GCF of both of these terms is y minus 2, and we are left with y minus 7. And we're going to finally drop that down to our factor line. Negative y times the quantity y minus 2 times the quantity y minus 7. Let's do it again. So here we're again asked to factor each trinomial. So we have x squared plus 6x minus 8. So again, we are factoring. So the first thing we ask ourselves is, do we have a GCF? And the answer is no, there's no GCF. So then we identify our A, B, and C values as 1, 6, and -8. And then we multiply our A times C, which is going to be -8. Identify our B, which is 6. We want to find all of our factors of 8. So that's going to be 1 and 8, 2 and 4. Now, at first glance, you might automatically be like, oh, well, 2 and 4 is going to add up to become 6, no problem. But remember, you need to take into consideration the signs. So we look at the C value, that's a negative sign. So that means that our signs for these are going to be different. And the larger number is going to match B, so the larger number is going to be positive. So the larger number is going to be positive, the smaller numbers are going to be negative. And now, do either of these pairs add up to become 6? And the answer is no. And the reason it's no is because this trinomial is not factorable. When something is not factorable, that means it can't be divided by anything, which is also known as the polynomial is prime. So you may see it in two different ways. You being told that it's not factorable, or being told that it's prime, so that we can't factor it. Part B, I'm sure you can guess, it should be prime. So you can go ahead and take a look at that problem. Let me know if you have any questions on that. And the last couple of examples are just more factoring. So, again, we have a trinomial that we're asked to factor completely. Do we have a GCF? That's 2x to the power of 4 minus 4x cubed minus 6x squared. So what's our GCF? Is there a GCF? Yes, there is. If we look at all of our coefficients, 2, 4, and 6, we can divide each of them by 2. And if we look at the variables, x to the 4th power, x to the 3rd power, and x squared, we can divide everything by x squared. So that's going to be our GCF that we will put on our answer line down here. 2x squared. What's left over when we factor that out? X squared minus 2x minus 3, something that's so small. Now, the reason that we factor out the GCF at the beginning is because this gives us smaller numbers to work with, and smaller numbers are always easier to work with. A is 1, B is -2, C is -3. We identify a times c, which is -3, and b, which is -2, and the only pair that we have for this are 1 and 3. Our signs are going to be different, and the larger number is going to be negative. And does this indeed multiply, or I'm sorry, add to become -2? And yes, it does. So we'll use that to expand our original, our expression here. X squared plus 1x minus 3x minus 3. In our 4-term polynomial, we factor by grouping. And again, because there's a negative in the middle, we add and we move the negative towards the 3x. The GCF of our first group is x, and we're left with x plus 1. The GCF of our second group is -3, and again we're left with x plus 1. The GCF of these two terms, right, this is all about the GCF. It's all about the GCF, x plus 1 times x minus 3, which we're finally going to go ahead and put on our factor line here, x plus 1 and x minus 3. Part B, same thing, but here again we run into the case where it's not in the correct order, right? Remember, we want it to be in the standard form ax squared plus bx plus c. So we have to rearrange this first. When we rearrange this, we're going to bring our x squared term up front. So since the minus is in front of it, that means this is -2x squared. Then we have minus x, and finally plus 1. So now that we've written it in standard form for a trinomial, we want to identify if there is a GCF. And if so, what is it? Well, there's no numbers that stand out. However, because the leading term is negative, we are going to need to bring a negative out with the GCF. And because we don't have any actual number to divide everything by, we need a placeholder of 1. That would be helpful. So again, let's get our factor line here. I'm going to drop the -1 there. Now, in addition to dropping -1, you could instead, you could instead drop just the negative if you're comfortable with that. So we're left with 2x squared plus x minus 1. And if you notice, every time we factored out a negative number, it just changes the signs for everything. That was negative, now it's positive. That was negative, now it's positive. That was positive, now it's negative. And like we've done many, many times, now we identify our a, b, and c values. A is 2, b is 1, c is -1. A times c equals -2 and b equals 1. Our factors of 2 are just 1 and 2. Our signs are going to be different. The larger one is going to be positive. And does that add up to become 1? Yes. So we use that to expand our expression. 2x squared minus 1x plus 2x minus 1. Since we have 4 terms, again, we go ahead and we group. The GCF of our first group is x. We're left with 2x minus 1. The GCF of our second group is nothing, right? So we have a placeholder of 1, 2x minus 1. We can factor out a 2x minus 1 because that's what they have in common, and we're left with x plus 1. And that's what we're going to go ahead and drop down on our answer line with the -1 there in front, or just negative in front. Okay, one last example. Right here, 4x cubed minus 2x squared plus 30x. So, what do? Right, first we factor out the GCF, or we look for a GCF. Is there a GCF? Yep, there is. the GCF, we can divide, let's see, 4, 22, and 30. Can't divide them all by 4, but we can divide them all by 2. And then x cubed, x squared, and x, we can definitely factor out an x with that. So we'll have a factor line here. We'll drop down our 2x. And we'll figure out what do we have left once we factor out the 2x. That would be 2x squared minus 11x plus 15. And now, like we've done so many times, identify our a, b, and c values. 2, negative 11, and 15. A times c is 30. B is negative 11. Our factors of 30, 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10. I can't divide it by 4, but I can divide it by 5. So 5 and 6. Our signs are going to be the same, and both of them are going to be negative. And which one here is going to add up to become negative 11? That would be negative 5 and negative 6. So again, we use the negative 5 and negative 6 to expand our negative 11x. So we have 2x squared minus 5x minus 6x plus 15. I have 4 terms, so I need to factor by grouping. We have that minus in the middle, so we need to push the negative to the 6 and make that into a plus in the center. We can factor out, not very much. We can factor out an x from there, and we're left with 2x minus 5. Here we can factor out a 3, and it would be a negative 3 because the leading term is negative. So negative 6 divided by negative 3 is 2x, and then 15 divided by negative 3 is negative 5, right? And see how that we have that in common. So in common we have a 2x minus 5, and as our leftovers from each is x minus 3. So that's what we're going to drop down onto our factor line. So our final answer is 2x times the quantity 2x minus 5 times the quantity x minus 3. And that's our final answer. Oops. So great job with this section. I know it was a really long one, but great job. We have one more video coming up with section 6.4.